Hi, everybody. It's great to see you here for our third event in the 9th Annual National Agenda Speaker Series, brought to you by the University of Delaware's Center for Political Communication, with support from the Office of the Provost. We're also proud to have as a co-sponsor tonight the Center for Black Culture. This year's theme, as you saw, is Direction Democracy. We're looking at where we've been, where we're at, and where we're going in this 240-plus year experiment that is uniquely American democracy. I'd like to remind our audience that civil dialogue is vital to the success of our program, so let's agree to be candid but also courteous of each other's views. We'll have an audience Q&A at the end of this talk, and you can tweet using hashtag #UDelAgenda to join the conversation. Tonight, Jamelle Bouie is a columnist for the New York Times, just starting this past January. He is also a CBS News political analyst and former chief political correspondent for Slate magazine. His columns cover US politics, race, elections, and public policy. So please join me in giving a big University of Delaware welcome to Jamelle Bouie.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. Well, I know we all know that there's been some big news today, I think.
Tiny, a little bit.
But I'm actually going to start with a different topic. You are also a photographer. If you can see on the screen up here, I have posted a picture of one of your photographs.
Yes.
You are a talented photographer. In fact, one of your recent photos showed this elusive creature. I don't know if you know that our mascot is a blue hen.
Oh.
What draws you to take photographs? We were talking about photography earlier. What kinds of scenes inspire you when you're not deluded by the day's news?
That's a great question. First, thank you for having me. Thank you all for coming out. So this particular photo, I'll say, this scene caught my eye because it's just kind of funny, right? Like it's a giant blue chicken and then a woman completely clad in blue. And I should have she was actually looking, because that's on top of the National Gallery of Art in DC, and she was looking out towards the Capitol, and kind of like a creeper, I kind of just like stood there waiting for her to move in just the right place so that there was some symmetry in the frame, and then I took the picture. But the thing I like about photography is that it just uses a different part of my brain. I spend so much time either talking or reading, researching, that it's nice to deal in a medium that is visual, that it's not like I'm thinking about the frame and I'm thinking about the image, but so much of it is kind of instinctual, sort of you walk past something or you see something and in my brain it's sort of immediately an image forms and I want to take it. And it's just like a nice respite from spending more or less most of my days on politics.
You said you read about a book a week?
Yes.
So does this help balance out that kind of wonky nerdiness of reading and having also this creative element to it?
Absolutely. Although I'll say I read all the time, but I'm not always reading stuff for work. Or if I'm reading something that is history or sociology, it may not directly relate to what I'm going to do for the job. But it is 100% the case that photography, I have a dog and I have to walk my dog several times a day, and so that's kind of an excuse to leave my house or leave where I'm working, bring a camera with me, and kind of just wander around with the dog and kind of remove myself a little bit from work.
All right, well, now you're back at work.
Now I'm back at work.
We're going to move on to the elephant in the room. You tweeted this earlier today. This is a GIF, if I can make sure it animates properly. Whoops, no, it didn't animate properly.
It's just an old man saying, "Oh my God, he admitted." from the show, I Think You Should Leave with Tim Robinson. Right.
So you tweeted this GIF this morning when the infamous transcript or memo was released. So can you tell us a little bit about what it's been like to process this news and to report on it over the past 24 hours or so?
Right. I mean, it's very striking, right? So the timeline as we have it is that during the summer, Mueller gives his testimony. It kind of falls flat a little bit. All the controversy and the maybe will Trump get impeached over the Mueller report fades away. And then the next day, the president has a conversation with the president of Ukraine, who, it should be said, is a former sitcom actor who is the star of a sitcom about an ordinary man becoming president. And then he becomes president. When I think about that, and then I think about our president being the star of The Apprentice, I wonder if television was a bad idea. But so the next day, after Trump essentially got out of the pickle of the Mueller report, he contacts the president of Ukraine to solicit dirt on one of his political opponents, to basically do the thing that he had been accused of doing. And I think part of what's happening in the political world is essentially everyone trying to get over the shock of that fact, that even people who gave him the benefit of the doubt are reconsidering that here is a president who has not learned anything, who in fact may have been emboldened by the fact that he saw no immediate consequences in the wake of the Mueller report. And so is trying again, and I made this argument in a column today, to recreate the conditions of 2016, to have a foreign government intervene in the election, to dig up dirt against his likely opponent, to sort of tar his likely opponent with corruption, with malfeasance, with all of these things, in an effort to make his opponent as unpopular as he is. And in that race, in a race when both candidates are unpopular, then the president figures he has a good chance of winning.
Well, so what I'm finding really fascinating, and we talked about this in the classroom earlier, is this really a different moment, a unique moment in history? And a formal impeachment inquiry for a sitting president is set to begin for just the fourth time in over 240 years of American history, and 400 years since the first slaves arrived here. We'll get to that second part. I want to talk about the 1619 Project that the New York Times has taken on. But give us some context here. How unusual is this impeachment inquiry? Is it political theater, or does it spell real problems for this presidency?
I think it's genuinely unusual. It's not the case. So the framers introduced the impeachment measure into the Constitution and debated it, and their expectation is it would happen pretty often. Not all the time, but their expectation was that, more often than they'd like, there would be a judge or a president who was just not up to the duties, who had committed high crimes or misdemeanors, and the impeachment power would be used with not all the time, but some relative frequency, more common than we see now. But as you say, it's just the reverse. It's extraordinarily rare, and I think that's probably a good thing, right? That there ought to be some presumption that you're not going to try to impeach a president you merely disagree with, that you dislike, who you'd rather see do different things, that you respect the democratic process enough to basically let most offenses fall under that. That for most things, if you have a problem, you just need to defeat the guy in the next election. But there are times when, presidents do things that so violate the norms around the office, that so violate the expectations of the office, that impeachment is a reasonable remedy. And I think the immediate, when thinking about the politics of this, people jump back to Clinton. When thinking about the precedent, people often jump back to Nixon. But I think the relevant precedent for this impeachment is Andrew Johnson. What was Andrew Johnson impeached for? Technically, he was impeached for a law, the Tenure of Office Act, which is probably unconstitutional. The law was that the Tenure of Office Act said that the president could not dismiss a cabinet official without the Senate's consent. You had the president to let the Senate know. The Senate didn't necessarily have to vote on it, but they had to be informed. Given the president's powers of appointing and staffing the cabinet, that kind of seems on its face not kosher, right? It's not really a law you can pass, but it existed. And when President Johnson dismissed Secretary of War Stanton, the Senate or the Congress leapt. Like, look, we don't like this guy. He violated this law. He's clearly a tyrant. we're going to impeach him. And that was the pretext. But the real reason was that for the past 2 years, 3 years, Johnson had been a foe of Reconstruction. He had stymied the Republican efforts to reconstruct the South, to extend voting rights to African Americans. He had turned a blind eye to vigilante violence and racial violence against African Americans. He had essentially become an ally of the former Confederates. And this is what one of the articles of impeachment said, he was using his office to sort of stir up the kind of hatred and violence that was tearing the South apart, tearing the post-Civil War South apart. And that to me is a more relevant example, because here, I think if it's the case that President Trump has been trying to solicit foreign intervention, that is a genuine offense. If it's the case, as the Mueller report details, they try to obstruct justice, that is an impeachable offense. But I think the thing that impeachment advocates and many people in the country are trying to grapple with is the fact that the president has used his office to incite, right? To incite the worst of our feelings and to incite the worst attitudes and threads in like the American public life. And if he is impeached, I think we will have a pretext, but the real reason he'll be impeached is basically for kind of violating one of the core premises of the modern United States, which is that we are a multiracial democracy. We're not a white man's democracy. We're a democracy where everyone has a claim to equality. And Trump has vocally, I think, stood against that in the same way or in a similar way as Johnson did.
Well, let's bring up what came out today, which was this unclassified now document, transcript, memo. How much attention, what's come up in this story is Biden, former Vice President Joe Biden, alum of the University of Delaware, and his son and their dealings. How much attention should we be paying to this Biden-Ukraine roots of this story? Is there a story there? How have the media dealt with this kind of 1-2 punch of Biden/impeachment? What do citizens need to know about this part of the story?
So my understanding, there's a couple things. It's first the case that it's true that Biden had bragged about getting a prosecutor fired. This was in 2016. My understanding is that at the time, among Democrats and Republicans, this was understood as like a good thing, that this was a prosecutor who wasn't challenging corruption in the country, that no one, if you go back to the 2016 to when all of this occurred, no one was saying anything about impropriety for Joe Biden. Hunter Biden, it's clear, is engaged in the kind of influence peddling and buckraking that I think is very unsavory, right? The trading on your name to pull an easy check is like not great. But is it a scandal? It's no more a scandal than, say, the activities of Ivanka Trump and of the Trump children, right? They're kind of doing something similar. I think it's all not great, and I wish they wouldn't do it. But the case that the president's making that this is evidence of some serious corruption, I'm just not sure is true. What is the case, though, and sort of evidence for this is that if you look at, not evidence, but sort of a sign that this is not as serious as I think Trump wants it to look, is that even other Republicans, Mitt Romney, Cory Gardner, Ben Sasse of Nebraska, when asked about all of this, are far more quick to say, well, let's look at what the president's saying about Ukraine than they are going to Biden. The president's staunchest allies jump to Biden, but other Republicans who aren't so quick to defend the president are a little more circumspect. As for how the press has handled this, I think in the beginning you saw a little bit of this making the scandal or making the news event about the potential Biden impropriety more than the evidence that the president was trying to solicit foreign intervention. I think now with this readout, which is, if you haven't read it, it's a very striking, the whole circumstance around it's very striking because Pelosi announced yesterday she was going to pursue impeachment or made it very clear that was going to happen, and Trump calls her and is like, can we work out a deal? Can we figure something out? Because I don't want that to happen, very obviously. Today they said we're going to release the transcript or this readout, and you would think if they're going to release this, then it can't be that bad, right? It can't. If they're going to release this to the public, then it can't possibly be that bad. There's not going to be a smoking gun. It's going to be hard to parse. We're going to see something that's just going to be a little bit of a disappointment. They released this readout, and I'm reading it, and like the gift suggests, I'm just sort of like, he just said it. He just, you guys were to buy stuff from us, well, I need you to do us a favor first. And it's so explicit that the only thing that could make it more explicit is if Trump like turned to the camera and said like, I want to do some crimes. Like that's
Like a la The Office.
right. Just sort of directly into the camera. It's crime time. So I think that the extent to which this readout is kind of a smoking gun, and because it's a redacted document, it's not the entire conversation, suggests even more. And given that this isn't the only conversation, given that the whistleblower complaint is not necessarily about this conversation, it really kind of suggests that there's more out there that's far worse than what we're seeing right now. And that that realization has reoriented the coverage back to, Trump, Ukraine. Biden sort of receding, and additional reporting on the Biden stuff is sort of undermining the idea that he is necessarily involved in some kind of serious corruption.
Well, I receive emails from all candidates during presidential elections. My inbox is pretty much always full. But I'm going to bring up an email from Trump's campaign last night. It says, Dems launch impeachment effort. And he said, Nancy Pelosi just formally called for the first step towards my impeachment. There's lots of capitalization and exclamation points. This is just another smear job and a pathetic attempt by Democrats to rip the power from the people. I've done nothing wrong. Trust me, you'll see the transcript. It's time to set something straight once and for all. The Democrats' constant personal attacks, vicious lies, et cetera, their goal has always been to silence you, Lindsay, me among other supporters apparently. They want to steal your voice and your vote. So what I wanted to ask you, because you have such a great understanding of political history in the United States, Trump uses this kind of language regularly, suggesting that it's his supporters, it's me, or the people he's emailing who are the ones who are threatened. Is this just a simple fear appeal, a simple way to attract people to his message, or is this something more than that? Does it have a root in previous campaigns where fear appeals might have been used?
I think it's both and, right? It is just a fear appeal, reaching out to supporters and trying to scare them into donating money. I think it also, you can see sort of a Nixonian style of politics, right? This Nixonian idea of a silent majority, of the president being both an elite but not of the elites, of standing as kind of a representative or avatar of ordinary people who are put upon, in Spiro Agnew's words, by the nattering nabobs of the media, of elite culture. And it's clear to me Trump is not just channeling that here, but has been trying to channel in his entire presidency. In his inaugural address, he speaks of the forgotten man, which is an FDR phrasing, but also I think also evocative of the silent majority. Mm-hmm. He constantly says or implies that he won a great majority in the presidential election, that his voters kind of represent an authentic America, and I think that too stretches back to this Nixonian idea of dividing the country into this silent majority that doesn't openly speak out in favor of his politics, but exists and is for him, versus this elite class. The problem for him is it just hasn't been effective, right? It's not like an effective mode of discussion for him, precisely because I think most people, and there's polling to this effect, don't like the guy. Even a good chunk of people who will vote for him next year don't like the guy. There was, I think, a Quinnipiac survey, or maybe an NBC News survey that came out very recently, the past couple of days, where something like 70% of surveyed voters said, regardless of what they thought of, how they approved of his job performance, said, well, we just don't like the guy. And that wasn't the case for Nixon in like 69 or 70, 71 or 72 even. And that kind of, that basic reality means that this kind of appeal to fear, this kind of trying to evoke a great majority that actually supports him, it's just not going to work.
Well, I was going to bring up, and maybe you have a couple words to say on this, and then I want to move on, but the 1828 John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson fight was also very riddled with name-calling. John Quincy Adams was labeled as a pimp. Andrew Jackson's wife was called, I'm not going to say it, not so nice name for a woman. One paper reported from my hometown of Cincinnati, the Cincinnati Gazette, General Jackson's mother was a common prostitute brought to this country by British soldiers. So I'm curious if this is something that's uniquely American. Is this just like part of who we are? We
Right.
call each other names at the national level when we're running for office? Or is this something that's like every, so often it kind of resurfaces?
I mean, I don't have a sense of like comparative politics here. Like, I'm not sure how electoral contests have played out in other countries, but it's certainly the case in the United States. Name calling and insults have a long history in our elections. In the election of 1800, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were vicious towards each other. It's funny to think. For me, it's always useful to try to put yourself into the moment of an historical moment. And so if you're in 1800, Jefferson and Adams aren't the founding fathers yet. They're kind of just two very prominent politicians who have their supporters and their fierce detractors. And in that election, the detractors on both sides did not hesitate to go after the others. Trying to think of another good election for just vicious insults. The 1864 election was a remarkably racist election with the Democratic opponents of Abraham Lincoln. The term miscegenation was coined in this election to refer to what Abraham Lincoln was going to do. If he got reelected, he would, the blacks would come and take over and marry your daughters, and et cetera, et cetera. There is the 1888 election where the slogan, the anti-democratic slogan, the Republican slogan is rum, Romanism, and rebellion. That if you elect the Democrats, they're going to get people drunk, bring in the Catholics, and then maybe rebel against the United States again. Who knows? So this stuff is standard issue. And honestly, it's really the last 50 years of like relatively, up until recently, relatively low heat elections that are the anomaly. Something like 2016, in terms of the heat of it, is probably more in keeping with how elections in this country have been than something like 2000 or 1996 or 2008.
So let's bring back 2016, right? All right, well, let's go into an alternate universe here, which is, I also get emails from the Biden campaign. So in an alternate universe, Biden's team sent this out about the same time as the Trump campaign, and he suggested that we've got bad news. Trump is using the Oval Office to pressure a foreign power to interfere in the 2020 election, and it gets even worse. A new poll has us down in Iowa. Are Iowa poll numbers really worse than a president trying to interfere with an election?
I mean, for Biden right now, they are. For Biden, that's actually the number I'd probably be stressing the most. I mean, they're not worse, although I think it's interesting that Biden brings this up brings up the intervention, because I think there's this way in which, over the weekend, right, it was still the case that Speaker Pelosi was hesitant to embrace impeachment, was still kind of an opponent of impeachment. The moderate Democratic members of the House were still on the fence or even opposed. But the revelation that the president may be trying to cheat, basically, in the election a second time, I think threatens the interest of those Democrats, of Pelosi, of Biden, in a way that the Mueller stuff didn't, right? The Mueller stuff happened in the past. It represents, the obstruction even happened in the past. It represents a violation of presidential authority, but it didn't have any immediate consequences going forward. But this does. This might mean that, again, whoever's the nominee may face the same kind of gauntlet of circumstances that Hillary Clinton did. And that, I think, was enough to push over a lot of Democrats into saying we at least need to offer, without removal, it's a little more than a censure, but it's still a censure, and it's still something that has an effect on the political landscape.
Was there something unique about this Ukraine situation that makes it more digestible for Americans, it makes it more understandable for them than the previous sort of threats for impeachment?
I think the fact that, this is why the readout's so useful, because it's very simple, right? Like it's the president giving a call to another foreign leader, saying we want to do X, and the president saying we need to do Y. It's very simple to explain. Even if some of the underlying issues might be a little complicated, the basic narrative is very easy. Whereas with Mueller, admittedly, you kind of had to be a little deep in the weeds. It was sort of, you had to study up a bit to kind of figure out exactly what Trump had done wrong. But this is far more digestible. It's far easier to understand, and I think that's really going to make a difference. Right now, there is some talk that they will limit the impeachment inquiry to just the Ukraine stuff. I think that would be a mistake. I think that this is probably an opportunity to unite a variety of different investigations under this sort of the same roof and draw up articles of impeachment, if they're going to do it, that kind of runs the gamut of what they believe the president has done.
Well, if we all don't mind, I'm going to move on from this issue of impeachment. This kind of came up so quickly yesterday, but I'd like to talk more about a project that you're involved in. The 1619 Project from the New York Times is about reframing the country's history around the arrival of enslaved Africans to English North America. And I wanted to point out in a recent column you noted that you've received considerable pushback, particularly from conservatives. You said they've made a forceful attack, in particular, on the idea that the founding was bound up in slavery and white supremacy. You noted that in the New York Post, Rich Lowry of the National Review called this idea odious and reductive lie. The Federalist said it's a sweeping historical revisionism in service of contemporary left-wing politics. I could go on and on. How do you respond to these criticisms, and is there any way a project like this could convince or somehow get through to a white nationalist or someone who has been raised with that sort of ideology?
Well, for those particular responses in that column, the case I made was that these critics, who I attempted to read in the best possible faith, were relying on an older historiography, an older understanding of the founding that hadn't kept up with what we know, more recent developments in the last 30 years, and what we know about the founding era. And the two books I cited, one called The Common Cause, the other called Slavery's Constitution. And there's a few other books I cited, but those were the two I relied on for making this argument. Both books make the case, or deal with the role of race and racism in the formation of both the revolutionary cause and in the formation of the Constitution. So my response to those critics is not to sort of hand-wave away the objection, but to say, I get what you're saying. Here is my evidence, right? Here is what I think is the history that addresses your critique. And in the case of those particular critiques, The Common Cause, it's a fascinating book, highly recommend it. And it deals with the problem the American revolutionaries faced at the outset, which is that we always talk about the Americas having been just 13 separate colonies, 13 own countries. That can be a little overstated, but it was the case in some critical ways, which is how do you imagine yourself as a revolutionary? You're likely a Virginian or you're from Massachusetts. That's kind of the hotbeds of rebellion. How do you convince some large number of your fellow colonists that A, your grievances are the same, B, you should understand yourselves as fighting or existing under a common banner, and C, that you're all something called Americans, right? That you all have this common heritage. And the book makes the case that the way the Patriots did this was by tying the threat of Britain to the threat of slave rebellions, to the threat of Indian attacks, to kind of a racialized notion of danger in the colonies, and to say the British are encouraging these racial others to attack us, and we should be unified in response to that. And to make this case, the author, whose name I can't recall at the moment, relies on widely circulated newspapers and pamphlets, and not so much the front pages, but the back pages, which held propaganda and advertisements and all that kind of thing. And it's a deeply researched book, and I think it makes a good case that when thinking about the formation of American identity, we have to consider the extent to which racism and racial othering helped pull it together, helped give it cohesion. The other book is called Slavery's Constitution, and it's a much simpler argument, and that is just that the Constitution did two things simultaneously. It established a powerful federal government, and then it insulated the institutions of slavery from the power of that government. And so Congress there's a 20-year moratorium on trying to end the slave trade. Congress couldn't touch it. Congress couldn't tax slave imports. Congress couldn't levy a tax on the enslaved people that slave owners held. There's all these things Congress could not do, which had the effect of keeping slavery untouched by federal power. And if the framers were right, or some of them were right, and slavery was bound to die off anyway, it's not a big problem. But as we know, that's not what happened, that instead technological advances, new territory made slavery far more lucrative. And in that environment, the Constitution helped facilitate the rapid growth of slavery in the early 19th century, up until just before the Civil War. So that's like it's a long explanation, but the main point is that the response to that kind of critique, I think, has to rely on showing your work and showing who you're drawing from and making a case, arguing from good history, primary sources, primary documents, and treating it like a journalistic question, right? As for whether this can persuade people who have been brought up with certain attitudes, I think it depends. I think someone who casually holds racist attitudes can totally be persuaded, because I don't think they're necessarily intrinsic to that person's self-definition. But someone who might call themselves a white nationalist, that's an ideological statement. And I don't think there's anything they could read that might budge them from that.
Well, I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second, because the students in my National Agenda class, as I was telling you earlier, are reading a book by moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt, where he argues that all kind of ideological arguments come from a moral perspective, and that conservatives and liberals are simply driven by different moral foundations. And he argues that you're never going to convince someone from the other side with reason, with argument, that you have to appeal to their emotions. So how do you approach that in your columns? Or do you
Right.
try to bring people over who, not just with reason, not just with the research, the great research that you do for your articles, but somehow try to get them to understand your perspective?
Yeah, I'm going to say, I don't think that I do. I'm just not, I don't know, by disposition, I'm just not the kind of person who necessarily focuses all that much on sort of how I feel about things on some visceral level. I don't necessarily think that's valuable. I am really concerned about making arguments. I'm not convinced that I can persuade someone by saying, here's how I experience this thing emotionally, and let me see if I can get you to understand that. Mm-hmm. I see my job as analysis, mm-hmm. as illuminating contemporary events, And that's how I approach it. And I hope, I hope that persuades people. And I hope that especially on like historical questions, that brings people around to my side. But I'm not actually too worried if it doesn't, and I'm not sure that I'm the kind of person who should be doing the work of that kind of persuasion.
Right. I just think it's fascinating because we're kind of learning different approaches to persuasion and communicating across differences. So, all right, I'm going to jump ahead to, you met my students earlier today. Some of them had some great questions I thought I'd throw at you before we toss it to the audience, literally toss it to the audience with our catch box, which is a tossable microphone.
Oh, I know what those are.
Yeah, it's fun. Ta-Nehisi Coates came out a few years ago in The Atlantic for a case for reparations. And my student Mandy says, kind of picking up on that, do you believe that reparations should be paid to the Americans who've been affected by slavery?
I think reparations should be paid. I don't necessarily think that slavery is the way, like the basis for it. Like Coates' argument actually says nothing about slavery, right? Coates' argument starts from the premise that after the Second World War, Black Americans in places like Chicago and many cities basically had their land taken from them through redlining, through financial instruments deliberately designed to defraud them of wealth. And it's one of those things where I think the legacy of slavery is such that it should inform our public policy making because there is a direct line between it and present day conditions. But in terms of like a reparations program, I think a steadier basis, a stronger basis for it is sort of documented examples of state-sponsored theft or state-sanctioned theft. So the federal government in Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, deals with this. The federal government facilitates the segregation of urban areas in this country. Segregation that basically acts as a wealth suck for Black communities, that they're unable to accumulate wealth because of redlining, because of this nexus of the government and lenders and realtors keeping investment away from those areas. We know, there have been commissions that dealt with this, that there was forced sterilization of African Americans in Virginia and North Carolina and other southern states. We know that there were, the best way to describe them are pogroms of violence against Black Americans in major cities all throughout the 20th century. This year is actually the centennial of like the biggest wave of them, the Red Summer. We have all of these events of violence and of theft, and we have, for the older stuff, we have children and grandchildren who are still alive. For the more recent stuff, for redlining in Chicago in the 1960s, for blockbusting in Detroit in the 1970s, those people are still alive. They're still like alive and well. Mm-hmm. And so that, to me, if you're gonna devise a program that's like compensating people for wrongdoing, that to me is where you look. That's where you go. As for anything larger than that, thinking in terms of kind of broader racial inequality, I don't necessarily think reparations is like a solution to that. It's useful to think about the last time the United States government paid reparations, and that's actually a very critical thing. Reparations are not a claim against white people, it's a claim against the United States federal government, which has been continuously existing for over 200 years. When you think about the last time the federal government paid reparations was to the children and survivors of Japanese internment. And there's never any expectation that would fix anything, right? It's more of a, we did incalculable damage to you, and so here is some recompense. And I think that's a way to think about it. In terms of fixing racial inequality or these problems, you need deeper-seated programs, broader programs that touch every part of the society.
Well, I'll move on to a question from Sanskriti, who we talked in Dan Pfeiffer's conversation a few weeks ago about this survey question that was basically, if you could wave a magic wand, who would be your Democratic presidential nominee. She says, if you could wave a magic wand, this is kind of a useful metaphor, and fix institutionalized racism in America, what would that look like in practice?
What would it look like in practice? Well, if I could wave a magic wand, what that would look like would be it'd be a massive program of integration across the entire society. My view of racial inequality, so I have two views. The first is that I think the problem of racism isn't necessarily the problem of people with like nasty attitudes. Racist people suck, I've experienced them, it's not great. But the problem isn't so much that there are people who hold these views. The problem is that your race has a direct impact on your life chances. It shapes your ability to accumulate wealth. It shapes your ability to achieve an education. It shapes the environment you live in. It shapes your health outcomes. It shapes all of these things that it ought not shape, right? There's no reason why that ought to be the case. This is coming off. And one of the sort of root causes of all of this is, as I was saying earlier, housing discrimination. It is land discrimination. And you can kind of go back, right, to emancipation. It is the fact that the freed slaves did not get any land distributed after the war. It is the fact that in the years after Reconstruction, tens of millions of acres of land were stolen from formerly enslaved people and their descendants. It is the fact that beginning in the 1910s and 1920s, local, state, and eventually the federal government would work to redline and segregate African Americans from jobs and opportunity, and that those advantages accumulate over time. There's compound interest for an investment. There's compound disadvantage as well. And looking in the present, what we see is compound disadvantage, the dividends of those actions taken a long time ago. And what that looks like spatially in the physical landscape is it looks like segregation. It looks like ongoing segregated neighborhoods, segregated schools. It looks like all of those things. So if I could wave a magic wand, it would be that what that wand would do is disentangle race from place. It would, your zip code would no longer determine your access to the kinds of goods you need to flourish. And in practice, that doesn't mean just radical integration of housing, integration of schools, integration of every possible facet of American society. And then I think you'd see some change.
All right, well, thinking about the 2020 election, my students are very interested in the candidates running for the Democratic primary. So Jagger asked, what major issue do you think that Democrats need to focus on that they didn't pay enough attention to last time around if they want to take back the presidency?
They want to take back the presidency. I was hoping this was going in a different direction because I had an answer for it. But they didn't focus on last time.
What do Democrats need to encapsulate? What message do they need to send in order to... Your column today was very much about how Trump has a 2016 path. He doesn't really have a different path of just insulting the other person. So, like, what has to happen in 2020 if a Democrat does indeed want to win?
So, I'd say one thing Democrats should focus more on, and I think they're doing, is drawing a bigger contrast between themselves and the other side on sort of economic policy. An interesting thing about 2016 is the number of voters who perceive Donald Trump as being a moderate Republican. And it's actually not hard to see why. He rejected cuts to Social Security. He rejected cuts to Medicare. At various points, he said he was going to repeal the Affordable Care Act with an offer basically health care coverage for everyone. He focused a lot on trade and on jobs, and he kind of sent these signals to voters that he wasn't a typical Republican. And then also he was like viciously anti-immigrant. But there is this cross-section of voters who they are liberal on economic issues, but very, very conservative, even reactionary on the issues of identity, on immigration, on race, and so on and so forth. In past elections, like 2012 or 2008, those voters voted for Democrats, not because they voted for Obama even, not because they suddenly became racial liberals, but because what was salient in those elections was the economic question, and the other side didn't add up. But 2016 was unique in that Trump was able to basically muddy the waters in economics. If you were someone who wanted more infrastructure and thought Medicare was good, then, Hillary Clinton said those things too, but also Trump did. And in addition, if you're in this cross-current, if you're one of these cross-current voters, in addition, Trump also doesn't like immigrants. And so you've just solved your problem. You know who to vote for. You're going to vote for this guy who hits both your bases. Those voters are still out there. And now Trump has been president for 4 years. He has an actual record on the economy and on economic policy. And I think there's a possibility that if Democrats sort of really emphasize an economic message and make sure it's very distinct from Trump, that they might be able to win over some of those voters, not all of them, but some of them, and peel back some of that support from voters who are voted for Trump, who are cross-pressured and disappointed in his economic policy making.
All right, a couple more questions since I have you until about 8:30, and we'll toss it over to the audience. 2 weeks ago on this stage, Rob Rogers, who's a political cartoonist, I don't know if all of you guys were here for that talk, he was fired from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette for his anti-Trump cartoons. This is a relatively new phenomenon to basically be called out on the editorial page for your political viewpoints, which is often seen as a place where you have freedom to express your political views. I'm curious, do you ever worry that your opinions could cost you your job?
I'm not, simply by comparison. A few of my colleagues sometimes write stories that are about people being mean to them on the internet. And if they can do that, then I think my well-researched columns stand a chance, won't get me fired. More seriously, the New York Times opinion page takes very seriously this idea that it's a place of sort of free discourse. And so unless I were to write something genuinely transgressive, something racist or viciously racist or sexist, or what have you, I think I'm in the clear, more or less. I think.
Do you think that the general public has a good understanding of the distinction between news pages and editorial pages?
Absolutely not. Absolutely.
Can you help
not.
us understand the distinction?
I mean, the distinction's clear to me, right? Sort of the reporters, they go out, they collect information, they have their sources, they talk to people, they synthesize all of that into a short narrative to explain to you a thing that happened. A happened to be because of C. Obviously, everyone has a perspective going into this, but for them, the perspective is not some opinion they're putting out there. It's determined by, it's the stories they're covering, who they're talking to, kind of the range of opinion, the range of views and perspectives they're including in the piece. But it's all fundamentally on the premise that they're trying to tell you something that happened and make sure you know why it's important, why we're writing about this thing, why you should know it. Those of us on the opinion page, on the editorial side, we're just kind of spouting off, right? We're just kind of, we also follow the news, but instead of telling you this happened and here's why, we're telling you this happened, here's why, and this is what we think about it. Mm-hmm. And this is what we think you should think about it, or this is what we think you should consider. And to me, it's a very clear-cut difference, but it's just not the case for most people. For most people, they see a New York Times link, and they don't make any distinction between if that's a person, is that the newsroom, is it a columnist, is it someone who doesn't even really work for the New York Times, but is contributing, is it a magazine article, what have you. And I don't know what to do about that. I think that's that's just a matter of trying to educate people about consuming news, and also just the only solution other than that is to put out the best possible product. So for people who do confuse the two, they're not going to think that, we're a rag.
I think that's partly my job as a professor. I think it's the job of educators largely to educate children and young people and young adults as to news literacy. What is news? How is it produced? How do you distinguish among satire versus, we were talking about this earlier, fake news versus real news? So I'll take responsibility for that. I'll educate the nation. All right, so you recently tweeted you recently tweeted the following question that one of my students, Jacob, found to be very interesting. He said, what would be a worse outcome for 2020 in the future of American democracy? Trump wins with an outright majority or an even larger electoral college misfire? Jacob says he voted in this poll himself, but he went back and forth thinking about it. Would you be able to discuss which you think would be worse and
Sure.
why?
Yeah. It's a terrible question, not because it's like poorly crafted, because it's a horrible thing to think about. I came up with this question it says apropos of a conversation I had last night. I was having dinner with an historian I had spoken to that evening and a couple friends, and we were just kind of talking about the election and upcoming politics, and this kind of occurred to me as a potential scenario. Now, priors here, I think that President Trump in office has done a lot of damage to our democracy. I think he's contemptuous of democratic government. I think he has no real understanding of it, and I think he has done, in his kind of drive to secure advantage for himself, done real damage to our democratic institutions. And so granting that, for me at least, that's where I'm coming from, what would be worse? If he wins next year, and he wins because a majority of the public says we want more of this, we looked at the last 4 years and we're just sort of like put it in our veins, or if like the last time around, most people don't vote for him, but his coalition is still electorally efficient and nets him 270 plus votes and he's president. I personally would be able to better deal with a majority of Americans saying, yes, please, more, than I would with a misfire. Because the solution to that first problem is pretty straightforward. Be better at politics, right? Just persuade more people, convince more people, mobilize more people, organize better, just be better at the game of politics, and you can win next time. But that other option, another electoral college misfire, a scenario where, and a larger one, right? So a scenario where, and not a very likely one, I think, not very likely, but a not unlikely one, where the president remains very unpopular, there's super high turnout. These two things will be the case next year. But the way the turnout is distributed, you have a ton of people voting in the most populous states. You have a ton of people voting in sort of electorally safe states for Democrats. And Trump gets just the right surge of people in just the right states to win an electoral college victory, except instead of a 2.1 million vote deficit like he had last time around, he has a 3 or 4 or 5 million vote deficit. I think in that scenario, I don't know how one responds to it, right? Like, how do you respond to that politically if you are someone who wants to sort of change politics, win a victory or whatever? Because in that scenario, you have succeeded at persuading your fellow citizens that Trump shouldn't be in office. Most people in that scenario agree with you if you are anti-Trump, that he shouldn't be there. And yet, despite winning 3 or 4 or 5 million more votes, which in any other circumstance would be a resounding victory, because of the distribution of his votes and our state borders, arbitrary things too. One of my favorite little arbitrary facts is that the eastern edge of the Florida Panhandle, basically, if you just lobbed that off and made it Alabama, or the western edge, which it is, having family from there, it is just Alabama, then in 2016, Hillary Clinton would be president. right? Just a tiny little, move the border just a little bit, and you have a different outcome. That to me is insane, but that's the system we have. Thank you, Founding Fathers. How do you respond to that? How do you respond to that situation? Because it's no longer an organizing or a mobilizing question anymore. It's a institutional question. Our institutions no longer translate the public will into any kind of any democratic outcome that people would understand as being fairly democratic. And I think it leads to sort of mass demobilization and mass disillusionment, and rightfully so. Like if he gets reelected and he loses the national popular vote by 5 million votes, I would be discouraged because I wouldn't know what to do about that, how to respond to that.
All right, well, I'm going to ask two of my students, Olivia and Justin. Thank you. Where's Olivia? All right, thank you guys. They are going to be responsible for tossing our catch box around, but while they're getting set up, most of my students really want to know, you have obviously a vast understanding of history and culture and politics. What sources do you rely on most for your news?
For my news, I feel like I rely on the same stuff that everyone else does. I read the newspaper that employs me.
Other than the newspaper that employs you.
I read a bunch of different political websites like Politico and The Hill, and I read the Wall Street Journal. I have subscriptions to the Journal and to Washington Post, and kind of just read the gamut of mainstream news. I don't really watch cable news at all. I think people shouldn't do that. It's bad. I watched it once. I just sat down and watched an hour of CNN, and it really stressed me out. There's loud flashing lights, loud lights everywhere, and people yelling, and I'm just no wonder everyone's so anxious. They're watching all of this stuff, and it makes them feel bad. I don't really listen to political podcasts. It's just a personal thing. I don't want to have politics be in my brain 24/7. Twitter I actually find useful just to see what other journalists are paying attention to and thinking about. It's dangerous to rely too much on that because there's a potential for groupthink, but if you just wake up in the morning and kind of see what you missed, what happened overnight, it's very helpful. And then I spend a lot of time, less so now these days, but I still do spend a lot of time kind of, reading new academic papers that I come across.
All right.
Looking
You're one of the 5 that reads our academic papers.
Looking for new research, trying to find other avenues for ideas other than just the news.
Oh, great, thank you. All right, it's time for audience questions. So Justin has the catch box. Anyone over here have a question? Looks like there's one right over there, Justin. Don't be afraid to throw.
Do I speak from here?
You just speak right into it.
Hello, Dr. Bouie. I hope I pronounce your last name right.
Yes, although I'm not a doctor.
Oh, well, in your knowledge, yes. However, I have a couple of questions. May I ask first and second, and then you can answer if it's okay?
Sure.
If they're brief, yeah.
Number one, with this most recent Ukraine situation, it gave me some suspicion about the whole thing. Do you think Putin is into this picture also? That's my one question.
First question, is Putin
is
involved?
Putin into this picture? Is it a triangle of Trump, Putin, and Ukraine president who is so young and not that experienced? They are going to control the 2020 election in this country again. That's my number. Do you think that could be the picture?
Do you want to ask your second question too, so I can just answer them both at once?
The second question is in regard to foreign policy, what's going on between U.S. and Iran. And Iran, the more U.S. is acting harsh and unreasonable toward Iran, and Iran is going toward China and Russia. So do you think there is going to be a triangle eventually in the future of Iran, Russia, and China, the power of the East?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your questions.
On the Putin question, I don't know. I'm not an expert in that those relations. What my I guess my educated sort of response would be is that I don't necessarily think so here. To me, this really seems like an example, an instance of the Ukrainian government recognizing how one might flatter and butter up the president to get something out of him, and the president being sort of like venal and corrupt, and using that as an opportunity to kind of advance his personal interest. Because one thing we know about President Trump is that he doesn't see really any separation between his personal interest and the office of the presidency. It's why he, spends taxpayer dollars as his property. It's why he sees nothing wrong with doing that, because it's not that he is in the office of the president, it's that he literally is, the president is like embodied within him, and it's like weird, he doesn't conceive of any separation. On the Iran question, by my lights, the most relevant consequence of the United States' hard line towards Iran, including tearing up the agreement reached under the Obama administration, is just that really no one believes the U.S. will honor its agreements anymore. That there's no sense of, no one wants to take a chance joining a high-stakes agreement with the United States because they believe the next administration or one after that might just tear it up. And so that may end up having the effect of driving not just Iran, but other countries who may have had tense relations with the United States into the arms of potential partners who they can at least count on some stability. And that wouldn't surprise me at all if that happened.
All right, let's take a question over on this side, maybe from a student. That would be great. Oh, nice catch.
So, working for the Times, you also mentioned that you subscribe to the Post and sometimes you tweet out their articles too. And I was just kind of curious to see what it's like from the inside, the little bit of a rivalry between the Post and the Times.
So there's two things here. I don't live in New York, and I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and don't necessarily work in the office. I'm only there sometimes, and so as far as I'm concerned, there's no rivalry. Like I don't, they may I don't know, like have a copy of the Post they throw darts at, but I wouldn't know. I think my sense of the reporters at the Times, because the other thing is that the New York Times is a massive organization. There are over 1,000 reporters and editors. I work for the opinion section, which is its own kind of thing. We have our own staff. We have our own floor of the building, right? We're kind of just, there's a real separation between us and the newsroom. And so over an opinion, we don't have any rivalry with with the Post or with the Journal or with any other similar kind of place. The Atlantic, my old employer Slate, what have you. In the newsroom, I'm not really sure how their relationship is with the other papers, but my sense is that it's like a friendly rivalry, right? Like they're going for the same scoops, they're trying to break the same kind of stories, especially in the politics section, the politics team. And so it's kind of, just they feed off of each other's energy. And they're both doing good work, and so I think it's a reinforcement thing as both sides try to best the other. And it's not hostile, I don't think, but there might be something there. But again, key thing here is I work from home and don't know any of those people.
So just disregard all of that. All right, another question. Back in the back, Olivia, thank you.
Okay, so you talked about how, in reference to the 1619 Project, the U.S. was partly founded through the Revolutionary War on these ideas of us versus them. And I was wondering how you think this idea has adapted into American culture over time, and why certain groups in the U.S., like Irish and Italians, who are maybe once the them, have been folded into the us, while other groups have not.
Right. Man, that's like that's a class. It's a whole field of study. The shortest possible answer I could give is that the positioning of enslaved people, natives, outside of the boundaries of Americanness kind of created you could think of it as sort of like 3 tiers of Americanness going forward, or 3 kind of segments of Americanness going forward. You had the groups that were still outside of it, right? And so up until, throughout the 19th century, up until the Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments, African Americans were kind of considered, legally after Dred Scott, incapable of being citizens. They were not citizens. They were like resident aliens, basically. But even before that, there was a widespread belief that black people just didn't really belong there. The American Colonization Society was formed in, I think, the 1810s. It was devoted basically to this idea that we'll solve the slavery problem by abolishing slavery and then shipping them all back to Africa. Problem solved. And so that sort of blacks defined outside the polity, natives to a similar extent, which is why there's usually very little, there's always opposition, but among the larger public, there's never really any serious opposition to the expropriation of native land because it was seen as belonging to Americans and not in belonging to white Americans, and that natives are kind of just, they were outside, they didn't exist within the polity. If they wanted to become part of the polity, they had to give up their nativeness and give up their traditions. And there are ways in which this is sort of like filtered through, our politics and our political culture since then. I'm trying to think of a good example. Sorry, this is such a broad topic, but I'm trying to think of like a very succinct thing. A good example is how, in the age of Jacksonian democracy, the expansion of democracy to propertyless white men came at the same time. Concurrent with that was the disenfranchisement of free blacks in the North. And these two things were actually seen in the moment as two sides of the same coin. That if we're going to let propertyless white men vote, then it does not make sense to let black men vote, because propertyless white men, they're still white men. They still have some entitlement to Americanness and American citizenship, and blacks don't really. And it takes the Civil War basically to like shatter that and expand the polity, at least temporarily, to include blacks. And even then, natives are still outside. Lincoln, the Lincoln government did fight wars in the West against Native Americans. So that's the black-white segmentation. But then you have like the foreign segmentation, and that's a little complicated because in the 1840s, a large wave of German immigration and Irish immigration. You have even larger waves of European immigration in the late 19th century, and in the moment, those immigrants were understood as being like not quite like us. I'm not going to call this, it's funny in this kind of ironic sense, but the kind of demographic panic you sometimes see now about Hispanic immigration, about the crisis at the border, was almost word for word happening in the early 20th century, except it was about Italians and Russians, right? It was sort of like these swarthy papists are coming across the ocean and they're ruining our society and we got to do something about it. They're bringing disease, they're bringing the rough equivalent of Islam then, of Islam now was Catholicism. The rough equivalent of like radical Islam was like anarchism. These anarchist Italians are coming over and they're ruining everything. And this was this inspired, harsh immigration restrictions in the 1920s. The Johnson-Reed Bill of 1924 basically put a strict limit on immigration from Italy, from Eastern Europe, from Russia, from the Balkans, and kind of had high limits or allowed a lot more immigrants from Northern Europe, from the UK and everything. But it was also the case that these immigrants were of European descent, like many Americans. And it was the case that they weren't at the bottom of the totem pole. At the bottom of the totem pole remained, especially in the eastern part of the United States and the South, black Americans, who were still kind of a pariah class. And so sandwiched between this pariah class and then kind of like Anglo-Saxon, white Americans, people of English stock and of German stock, are these people who it was possible for them to assimilate just enough to escape the stigma of their foreignness. And so, I mean, really, at this point, you're in 1930s, 1940s, and the Second World War, the Depression and the Second World War are these massive events that end up shared experiences that end up collapsing some of these distinctions and some of these categories and allowing some number of Italians and Eastern Europeans, so on and so forth, to kind of claim whiteness as an entitlement that brought sort of full citizenship. That is a very short summary.
Well, thank you so much. You've recommended so many books along the way today. Is there a book or an article or a series of writings that you might recommend around this topic, since you said this could be a course in and of itself?
Yeah, wow.
You can send it to me later if you want. I can share it.
Yeah, no, the one book that I found very influential is a book by a scholar, David Redeker, called The Wages of Whiteness, which kind of deals with white working class formation in the 1840s and 1850s. There's another book called Love and Something, that is about minstrelsy as a cultural product that helped develop kind of white working class identity, that, you know, by having this form of art that involved white men taking on black face, it both allowed audiences to sort of define themselves against something they were not. It's very interesting.
Well, I know you don't listen to podcasts, but the 1619 podcast deals with exactly
Right.
that. I think it's the third episode about the history of minstrel shows in this country and how they sort of were the first real roots of American music.
Right.
So I highly recommend the 1619 podcast to expand on some of this. So let's get a question from the middle here. Who has the cube or the catch box? Let's do the young man in the peach t-shirt.
I just wanted to know how you got started in your career in journalism.
Sure. It's not a very exciting story. I graduated from UVA in 2009. I basically majored in sort of like political theory, political philosophy, and I didn't want to go to law school, so I needed a job, and I stayed in Charlottesville for a year, kind of doing odd jobs for the university, not really doing anything systematic. But during this time, I was writing a blog about politics because all of this was concurrent with the 2008 election and sort of the first year of the Obama administration. I was always very interested in that stuff. So I was writing this blog, and through this blog, I met other young 22, 23-year-olds who didn't have jobs and were also writing and were trying to get jobs. And all of us ended up recommending to each other jobs that opened up, freelance opportunities, that kind of thing, kind of a little mutual aid network of broke 20-somethings. And a fellowship at a magazine called The American Prospect was up. The person who had it before had moved on. And so I applied for it just like 2 months before I was going to lose my job. And like 2 weeks before I lost my job, they were like, hey, you're hired. And I was like, thank you. This is a godsend. And that's how I got into journalism, more or less. For reasons I still don't understand, the Prospect hired me, and I got a crash course in journalism. And it turned out, the fellowship lasted a year. It turned out I was not terrible at this, and they renewed it for another year, and then I kind of have stuck with it. I have no other skills, so this is what I do now.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. Let's take it all the way in the back on the... Thank you, Justin.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Bouie. I'm sorry if I'm butchering your last name,
No,
for coming today.
Just gotta remember there's no accent on it because it's very American, so just like Bouie.
It's like what rests in the water.
Yeah.
Mr. Bouie. All right, well, thank you. My question draws back to the earlier conversation we were having about impeachment and the whole proceedings of it. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was so reticent in pursuing impeachment inquiries because of the ability it would have to divide and kind of rile up the country over this very divisive issue. So my question to you is, as a political analyst, do you see this impeachment inquiry as being a detriment to Trump's 2020 campaign, or more of as a tool he will use to rile up his base and kind of take us into the same 2016 situation? Thank you.
I guess my kind of priors here, right, is that Trump is unpopular. This is a thing that I think sometimes gets lost because his base seems so intractable and is so committed to him. But right now the economy is growing at a pretty decent clip. There's wage growth, unemployment's low. Under these conditions, a normal president, when I say a normal president, I mean just like a body that hung out in the office and said or did nothing, right? That sort of, you ever watch Community, the mascot of the school? That human, that human being, that flesh-colored human being with no facial features would have like a 55% approval rating, right? Sort of like would be genuinely popular because in the absence of a war that is capturing the public's attention, right? We are fighting wars, but they're not really in the public eye. In the absence of not serious economic deprivation, in the presence of growth, in the presence of general domestic tranquility, that's re-election, baby. That's how you win. But the fact that Trump has those conditions and his approval rating at its best possible circumstances, best possible scenario thus far over the course of the last 3 years is 44%. That's how high he gets. The fact that right now I think he's at around like 43%, that's the average. The fact that disapproval numbers have consistently been basically not just 55, 56, 57, but the majority of the disapprovers are strong disapprovers. This isn't people who would be persuaded otherwise. They just hate the guy. That's a sign of unpopularity. What that tells me as an analyst is that if next year we have a mild recession, his approval rating just tanks, right? He's kept afloat basically by the fact that things are going pretty well right now. And so with that as my premise, I do not see the world in which an impeachment trial of any kind helps him. Maybe it's a wash, maybe it doesn't ultimately have no effect on the outcome of next year, but it doesn't help him, because what is an impeachment trial? What is an impeachment inquiry? It's a unique event in the nation's history that involves the House of Representatives going through every possible bit of evidence of crimes that the president has committed. And we also know from public opinion over the past 3 years that whenever these kinds of things are in public view, whether they are the Mueller report, or whether they are something like what happened after Charlottesville, his approval rating takes a definitive dip. It always dips during these points. And so for me, an impeachment trial for an unpopular president, if nothing else, means his popularity is going to take a notch down and may not be able to even get back to that high water mark of 44%. So I don't think there's anything to worry about in terms of it making it popular, because the counterexample, Bill Clinton, ahead of impeachment was doing 58, 59, 60%, the public was in on Bill Clinton. And so when you had the impeachment trial, regardless of what you think about it, it was going against the current of public opinion. Most Americans didn't want to see him impeached. Right now, impeachment, I think 40% of Americans want to see him impeached. But if you dig into the numbers, it's something like 95% of Republicans oppose impeachment, and 70% of Democrats support it, with 30% who don't support it, and independents roughly evenly split. And so if now the Democrats have rallied behind it, if that Democratic number goes up, 80, 90% of Democrats support impeachment, then that's all of a sudden a majority of Americans support impeachment. That's the difference. That's it. So yeah, that's a long way of saying I think it's not going to help him. I can't imagine it helping him. It just seems crazy to think that there's a voter out there who's like, I disapprove of Donald Trump. I don't like the guy. I was going to vote for his opponent, and then he got impeached, and now I support him.
All right, very good point. I'm so excited that our next two speakers are coming from a very different perspective, from a more conservative perspective. We have Terris, who's a GOP commentator, and Chris Christie, who'll be here on November 6th. I hope you will join us for that. I'm going to wrap up before we say thank you so much to Jamelle for being here. I wanted to point out that yesterday was National Voter Registration Day, and we were on the green, and it was very exciting. And I didn't mean for both those images to come up, but last I heard, nearly 400 students signed up yesterday to vote on the green in a non-election year. So that's pretty exciting. Thank you. But I wanted to point out, I am like a graph nerd. You're a history nerd. I'm like statistics and graph nerd. This particular graph comes from the National Student, I'm going to mess it up. We call it NSOLV data that comes out every 2 years about universities and campuses who are about their registration to vote. And so of about 1,000 universities, the University of Delaware was measured in their registration rates, which you can see in the far left column. We increased our voter registration rates by quite a bit. I'd like to point you to the far right column, where you can see that from 2014, with a voting rate of, I can't read that from here, 14.8, thank you. All right, so this is a lesson in chart literacy. 14.8% to 41.6% of the University of Delaware student body voted in the 2018 midterm. That's more than double, and if you look right above that right chart, 39.1%, higher than the national average. So, University of Delaware, go vote. Go guys. Go Blue Hens. All right, so the last thing we like to do this year is I do what I'm calling my Doc Hoff's quick take, and I'm sorry my students are embarrassed that their picture is up here. One of the other things we did yesterday as part of National Voter Registration Day is we debuted our campaign this semester to engage in a nonprofit program called Free Intelligent Conversations. And did anyone see us yesterday on the green? Thank you. So we literally held up signs that said Free Intelligent Conversations, and you might notice a couple of famous famous people there, the president and the first lady. They loved the idea. What is it? It's talking to strangers about intelligent things. That's it. It's just about engaging in conversation with people that you don't know. And I was really worried that my students would not be into this, that they'd be embarrassed, that they'd be like, I don't want to talk to strangers, or that the people who would be walking by would say, why are you talking? What are you selling me? Why are you talking to me? I want to look at my phone. And I can't tell you guys how excited I was to see yesterday the students engaging in conversation, smiling at each other, laughing with each other, and really enjoying just engaging in conversation across differences. It wasn't about politics, it wasn't about religion, it wasn't about all this stuff that we have to kind of wrestle with every day. It was just questions like, what's the most inspiring thing someone has ever said to you? What would you do if you only had 24 hours left to live? Okay, a little dark, but still, brings up some interesting conversations with strangers. So on this campus for the rest of the semester, I want you guys to keep an eye out for my students who will be holding these signs. We're going to be doing another event on this Friday on the green from 2 to 4 p.m. There's also an RSO, a registered student organization, called Let's Talk that is engaging in the same activity, and their next meeting is on Monday at 5:30 in Memorial 124. So if you're a student interested in joining an RSO that is about just talking with others, it's a novel concept, I know, just talking. But as a communication professor, it excites me greatly to see students just really wanting to engage with each other. So before I wrap up, I want to remind everyone about our audio essay contest called Speak Up. We want you to tell your story. This is a 2 to 4 minute audio essay that all students are encouraged to submit entries to. There are cash prizes, so there's that to keep in mind. You can also check out cpc.udel.edu for all of our other initiatives and events. Sometimes I feel like we're doing so many things, I forget to report on all the things that we're doing. Finally, our next speaker is, as I mentioned, Terris. 1 week from today, right here in this room, she's a CNN political contributor, media commentator, podcast host, and former GOP communications director. What's interesting about her, she's a Republican commentator who's also not so fond of Trump. So kind of interested to see her perspective from a GOP perspective on what's happening in current government. So with that, I thank you all for being here, and let's give a big round of applause to Jamelle.
Thank you. Thank you.